In this video, we're going to learn about fiscal policy, which, as you know by now, I hope, is one of the demand-side policies used by government. So demand-side as opposed to supply-side, remember. So demand-side policies aim to impact aggregate demand. The government will do something with a demand-side policy that aims to either increase aggregate demand or maybe slow it down a bit. So there are two main types of demand-side policy the government uses. One is monetary, one is fiscal, and we're going to be looking at fiscal policy. And as you can see from our introductory slide, fiscal policy is all about taxation and government spending. So just to go back and think about why a government might use fiscal policy, we can look at our economic cycle diagram, and what we see on this is the green line, which represents actual GDP, and we see how actual GDP goes through cycles of peaks and troughs. But the blue dotted line shows us the GDP trend, and in an ideal world, what every government wants is for its economy to grow in a sustainable way. In other words, governments want their economies to grow in a straight line, like that dotted blue line, because in that way, we lose the peaks and the troughs. And as we've learned, at the peak of the economic cycle, where aggregate demand is really strong, we tend to get inflation, and we don't want that. So fiscal policy, like other policies, is used to try and squash those peaks down to get us back nearer to the trend line. On the other hand, if the economy is very slow and aggregate demand is at its lowest point at a trough, then what government wants to do is to stimulate aggregate demand to push that trough back up towards the trend line again. So all of these policies are aimed at sustainable economic growth and at keeping inflation and unemployment at bay to some extent. So, as I mentioned, fiscal policy is all about government using government spending and taxation to try and make those adjustments just described to aggregate demand. So fiscal policy is used at two different times. If aggregate demand is very slow, we're at the trough at the bottom of the economic cycle, government will try to use expansionary fiscal policy often. And this involves government spending, because we know that government spending is a component of aggregate demand. If government spending rises, then aggregate demand will rise. The other tool that governments have within expansionary fiscal policy is to reduce taxes. If they reduce income tax, then consumer spending is likely to rise because consumers have more disposable income. If governments try to reduce corporation tax, then business investment spending might rise because businesses now have lower costs. On the other hand, if we're at the peak of the economic cycle, where aggregate demand is roaring away and we're beginning to get more inflation than we would like, then government can use contractionary fiscal policy, which means that it has the choice of reducing its own spending, and again, we know that will reduce aggregate demand because government spending is a component of aggregate demand, or government can choose to increase taxes, and increasing income tax or corporation tax is likely to reduce consumer spending and business investment spending in the way just described. So expansionary fiscal policy will have the effect of shifting the aggregate demand curve out to the right. And we can see that when this happens, more is produced, but also the price level begins to rise again a little bit. On the other hand, we can see what happens when contractionary policy is used on the right-hand side here, and the aggregate demand curve in this case shifts to the left. And this time what we can see is that less is being produced, but the price level has also fallen. So why is government spending so important? Why is it such an effective tool in fiscal policy? Well, it's an important component of aggregate demand in most economies. Also, governments can choose what and where to make that spending. So they can have impacts in different regions that might be suffering more in order to give economies a boost in a particular part of the country or in a particular part of the economy. And of course, government spending can be used to provide public goods that wouldn't be provided by the markets, or to provide merit goods that might be underprovided. So at the current time, governments might think about using spending to increase healthcare provision, for example. And of course, government spending can be used to try to achieve greater equality within the society. The other part of fiscal policy, of course, is taxation, which we've mentioned already. So income tax, changes in income tax have an effect on the disposable income of all workers and, in fact, most citizens who pay income tax. If income tax goes up, we have less to spend, therefore consumer spending is likely to fall, and the opposite applies. We've talked about the link between corporation tax and business investment. If corporation tax goes up, businesses are likely to invest a bit less because they have less profit. But there are other taxes that can be used within fiscal policy. We can increase the tax on imports, for example. We can increase VAT, those indirect taxes that are levied on goods and services, and that might have the effect of reducing consumer spending at a time when aggregate demand was running away too high. So there are some general ways that taxation can be used via income tax and corporation tax, and there are some more specific ways that taxation can be used to control aggregate demand in particular regions or for particular goods and services. So if there is a direct tax, and by direct tax we mean income tax or corporation tax, if there's a direct cut in those taxes, it's likely that consumer spending will increase when income tax falls. It's likely that business investment spending will increase if corporation tax falls. So both of those changes are likely to have the effect of shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, and you can see clearly in this diagram how that increases national output, but also how it increases the price level. So for our final slide, we're just going to look at this in a little bit more detail, what happens, and we're using the example here of expansionary fiscal policy, but obviously we could look at the opposite of this, which would be contractionary fiscal policy. So government will only want to use expansionary fiscal policy when aggregate demand is very, very low and the economy really needs help in getting going again. So here are some of the options. We cut personal income tax rate, that boosts disposable income and adds to consumer demand or consumer spending. The same thing will happen if we cut indirect taxes such as VAT. That will lead to lower prices. People have more money to spend on other goods, and again that adds to consumer spending. With corporation tax, if we cut corporation tax, that means that businesses have higher profits after tax, and that's likely to add to their investment spending. And also, if there's a cut in tax on interest from saving, that will also boost disposable income and add to consumer demand. So fiscal policy is a strong and often used tool by governments. Okay, we're going to finish there. There are a few questions for you to answer now.